Hi everyone. So I have Lazarus today chatting, and Lazarus basically runs the HTMX podcast, and is also an early user of API Toolkit. So I figured I could just have a chat with him about his experience with API Toolkit as a platform, and also about his use case in general. So Lazarus, thanks for making this time.
Oh, thanks for having me on. Thanks for talking.
Yeah. So maybe as a quick start, could you tell us a bit about, the project that you're working on where you use API Toolkit?
Yeah. So, I mostly do web development, and I mostly use kind of could call it like MPA, like multi-page application stuff. Well, I actually don't use a ton of APIs, and in general, none of my stuff is sort of built on SPA. So that's kind of my primary work is, building these sort of full sites. A couple of years ago, I wanted to kind of expand into developing mobile applications. So I took one of the sort of large websites that I have and built what I call a companion app, which is I developed it in Flutter. And the way that I developed it in Flutter was the goal of kind of imagining that it was a web-based, because one of the problems with apps is they're very hard to update. I'm used to web development where you can just something's wrong, you just snap your fingers, make a change, push it up to the server. I should deploy to the production server immediately and make fixes. I'm just used to that. And so with apps, you have to go through this approval process. You have to go through iOS. You have to I do iOS and Android. Flutter kind of lets you do both. So my concept for this Flutter app is that it would actually be driven from the backend using JSON API that you would send, and then Flutter would interpret that, build the screens out of this API. So really, it's a API-driven backend app.
I think there's a name for those, server-driven UI, something like that.
It's funny. Now I realize there's options, but I to me felt like I had discovered something incredible because when I was building it, I had this revelation because I was struggling building this Flutter app. And man, I was almost to the point of I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this, because if something goes wrong, how am I going to fix it? And, it's just it's a totally different way of developing. And I wasn't really used to it and didn't really feel good about it. But when I made this kind of revelation in my mind of well, you know what? I could just build a generic screen in Flutter and then pass in everything. I have 4 or 5 different screens, and that's all you need. My apps are not they're not doing a bunch of stuff with the phone, built-in phone stuff. They're just conveniences, giving you the data you need, in whatever format. Now I've realized there are options, including I haven't checked out Hyper-V yet. There's these kind of options that are built in the communities that I kind of work in. I like Flutter, and my solution was kind of this own custom thing, and building it with these kind of JSON APIs sort of let me send in all the different screens that I wanted and fill it with the content. So when someone asks me for a change in the app, just make that on the server side and it's live immediately. I don't have to push anything to iOS or anything. So it's been great so far.
Well, that's it. The first time I came across the server-driven UIs was not even Hyper-V. It was a project called JSONnet. So JSON with an E-double-T-E. And all they did was, I think it was basically a HTMX, but written via JSON, in a sense that you write this huge, basically like HTML, to be honest, but in JSON. So you write this tree of components where each component is like an object, and the core of the engine is going to map the JSON that is coming from the network into actual components and render it.
Yeah.
And when I saw that, I was like, this is mind blowing. I don't use it anymore, but
yeah. So do you do any apps now? Okay.
No.
Yeah, because I do think there's something to this. I've just had such a positive experience. Now that the app has been up and stable and the customers love it, and I haven't, except for, I'll say recently, the reason I used APItoolkit was because I made a massive update to the app, and it had been running, smoothly for over a year. Didn't made any changes to it, no updates. So when I was ready to make this big change and add a bunch of new technology, that's when I found out, we had talked and you had mentioned API Toolkit and wanted to know that my app was stable, going to be stable through this transition where I added a bunch of new features. So, it was mostly read only before. I wanted to upgrade it and make it so you could add more stuff. So a lot more posts, a lot more data going into the system through there. We had like deleting, we had updating, so I made this kind of relatively large change and I wanted to be really sure that I wasn't breaking things.
When you say did that, what kind of insights did you get after integrating?
Yeah. So, I'll say like my experience with API Toolkit and like,
Yeah, please tell me.
that I don't use half of the features that are offered in API Toolkit, but what it did for me, first of all, he installed it. It's a Laravel app and I have an old Laravel app. Like I have not been good about keeping my versions. It just hasn't really needed it. Update my versions. I probably should do it at some point and use like Laravel Shift or something. It's an older version. And so that was my first concern was like, okay, most of the tools I use nowadays, step one, you have to upgrade everything just so that you can even get it to work with your system. I looked into API Toolkit to see if it had an option, even though it was an old app, and no problem whatsoever. I used the basic HP, may have set a version when I installed it. I kind of don't remember if it needed to. Do you know if it requires a certain version of Laravel? I mean, the thing is, I don't remember is whether I had to do a slightly updated version or whether the default one just works. Either way.
I know we have some minimum bound, but at the end of the day, we're not doing anything high tech, where we need the latest Laravel versions, for example.
Yeah, and I really appreciated that actually, because that was just, if I would have had to install, and I've come across this with a lot of packages, if I'd had to install an updated version of Laravel, I wouldn't have done it because that in itself is a large project. So I didn't have to do that. I used the package, which like you have instructions directly on the site. I just went through the instructions. They were pretty straightforward. You install the package, you copy I think it was a service provider maybe, to the right place. And it's basically middleware was it a middleware? Yeah, I think it was a middleware that gets added in. And, I set it to only on certain URLs, which I believe was kind of an easy setup in the system. And it's like, it worked just like immediately, which was cool. I appreciate that. So you did some nice work on that, Anthony.
Did you get spammed? I always have, especially people who have these huge applications, complain that immediately they integrate, they just get spammed with all of these emails in the beginning.
Yeah. So, first I set it up and it got the ping immediately. It showed up. It was working. It was exciting because actually like that's not the experience that I have integrating stuff, especially into an older app that often. And I saw that you had a bunch of options for integrations. Like Laravel was just one of many. So I know there's a lot of work that went into making that a smooth process. It was very appreciated on my end. Because I literally, within 10 or 15 minutes, I was just like getting these things on the dashboard. So, and I'll just say my understanding of what was happening, every route that was getting hit, this is not the primary app. This is not the primary thing. So it's a companion app. Not everybody is using it. It's not like the main application goes along with it. So I wasn't, we're not getting like thousands of requests a minute or something like that. It's relatively low usage. For every new URL that came in was sort of registering it. And I would see up in the dashboard, like here's a list. It would give me a little notification. Here's all the URLs that have been hit. It was kind of filing them away. So the first time it gets hit, it sends you a notification. Second time, it doesn't. And so each new URL, so it's kind of neat. I could see like, okay, someone finally used the maps today. All these different features that I have in the app. I'm like, oh, there we go. Somebody's using that. And so it was just the baseline. I did all this. I set this up before I started making any changes to the app or to the API that I was using. And I wanted to have this baseline of like, okay, first of all, I've never had any sort of observability in my application. And I've always assumed it's working smoothly and working great because I don't hear about it from the customers. So it was nice to actually see that was true for the most part. There was no 500s. There was, I was getting all 200s and I was getting out the traffic I expected, and all that seemed solid. And it was nice to set it up before any changes because I did have that baseline. And then as we started working on it, we were introducing new routes into our API. And so as we were testing it and as we were working on it, those new routes would pop up in the API toolkit. And it would say this route is new. You want to add this to the list. Yes, I would, but it's just kind of like what API toolkit kind of gave me during this process. It was like I could understand, you sort of have this mysterious idea of how the API is being used and how often it's getting hit. And I could sort of look at traffic because I do have a traffic monitoring system. And I get emails anytime there's a 500 server error. So I do have some things in place, but this was like an immediate feedback. Did this work? Are people hitting URLs they're not supposed to? And I think it just kind of made me understand exactly what was happening through the process. I had a place to go and check and see. This was a big deal. I really didn't want to break anybody's app. I was working really hard on.
Did you break anything?
No, so I got a 500, but this was because I told somebody that they could use a route. I was working with someone else who was helping develop it. I sent them a list of okay, here's the routes you can use now, and I hadn't pushed them yet. So I was watching an API toolkit and started getting the 500s, and I was like, oh, something's going on. And so I looked it up, and I was like, oh, okay, I never pushed the code that I said I pushed. And so this was just kind of I was able to fix it before they even told me about it, the person who was helping me work on it. So, yeah, I mean.
So did you find that you introduced a breaking change, for example, maybe updated a field in one of the existing endpoints?
So, I mean, we had actually talked about this. I interviewed you for the HTMX one, and I think I was hyper aware of not breaking things because, with iOS and with the Android app and everything, it's you don't know for sure that they are going to be able to download the new version of the app. And so it's hard to reconcile the old version and how that's going to treat a new format of JSON, a new format of. So I kept everything the same. And actually, the developer I was working with the app said basically how about this opportunity now to we can make the API better, we can make these changes. And it was actually changes exactly like you had talked about, just type of thing like changing message to MSG or vice versa. Had some ideas about the architecture of the API and how it could be more consistent through this. And I was just we're not doing any of that. No. Everything that was is, yeah, that's all going to be the same forever. That's just how it is. You also need to think about in the application receives a new JSON array or whatever it is, the current one is going to be able to handle that if it's different. Not can we make it so that the new one handles it? It's can this gracefully just ignore the data that's not for it? That was a hard problem to solve.
Justin, thanks for sharing. Can you tell us about this project, though? Is it something you can share?
Oh, yeah.
What kind of app is it?
Yeah, so it's a constituent service platform. So constituent service, so if you are an elected official, so I used to work in government, and I worked at the State House in Massachusetts. And part of what I did is, every area of Massachusetts has their representatives, has their senators. So representatives and senators, their office is supposed to act as a bridge between the people in their district and the government. They call with questions about services that are available, about bills that are about to be passed in the legislature, call just when they're angry. They want to express their dislike of whatever's happening, or either they want to say just good things about, thing that's happening. So people call the office all the time. We didn't really have a good system when I was working there to keep track of it all. And it's important to keep track of it all, because if you're calling your representative and they forget, that you called, or they forget to follow up with you, or years ago you called about the same thing, what have they done since then? So it was very hard to keep track of that. And then staff turns over and person was the only person who remembered, and now they're gone. And so this kind of things, you need a system to keep track of this, is kind of what I felt when I was working there. So when I left, it was always in the back of my mind. About 5 or 6 years ago, I decided to build that system, the system that I would have wanted if I was still working there. Elected officials keep track of who's been talking to them and what they care about, and so that now so our clients now, and we have a lot of the legislature in Massachusetts signed up, when somebody calls the office, they can immediately look them up and see in the last 5 years, the last 10 years, here's all the things this person has called about. Here's what they care about. And you can just immediately on the phone look at that, and you know who they are, you know what conversations you've had, you have all your notes, you have all your cases. So that's the system. And so
Interesting. So
yeah,
it's like a CRM, but specialized for constituents.
exactly. And part of the big value add that we add is that we import the voter file, so we know who is in that district as well. We have information about, what street they're on and, who else lives in the house. We have some basic demographic information about everybody in the district as well. So just as kind of a helper tool for everybody.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for yeah.
And then the app part of it is really just plugs into all of that other data, but is really just a convenience. They can just pull it up on their phone. I'll pull it up right now so you guys can see what the heck I'm talking about. If anybody's on the video here. So here's my little app. When I click on it.
Well, that's a pretty logo.
Thanks. So you've got a search up here, you've got all these things on the bottom, and this is mostly read only, but we've been adding in some other stuff. So all these screens, if you click, I'll try and click here and see, like, go to the cases page. All these screens kind of look similar, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's really just one or two views that I use, and I just send in different data through the JSON API and populate each page in a different way. There's a lot of cool features on here that mostly it's just kind of immediate access to everything from your account.
Yeah, so that is really that is very nifty and pretty nice. Interesting.
Yeah.
So since you did this migration, how have you found yourself using APItoolkit? Is it still useful?
Yeah, so a couple things on that. I don't use it that much anymore, like day to day, mainly because I don't need to. It's very stable. But I keep APItoolkit because I want to know if that's true, indefinitely. And right now, this is a relatively small app. I think what I use it for, APItoolkit in general, is kind of I use it to see traffic now. It's kind of my primary tool for just checking in, like, how are people using it? Who's using it? Type of stuff are they searching for? And like, I had my own tools to do this, but they just weren't as good. You can't see as much information. But I do use it for that. I think the bigger picture is that this model of, a sort of server-driven app really plays nicely with all the stuff that I normally build. So going forward, I want to sort of continue to explore that idea. APItoolkit is going to be kind of my main way of verifying that what we're doing is working and not giving people errors and not, because when something goes wrong, and it did, and originally when it first went out, if I make a mistake updating, when I send these JSON files, right now it's like a big messy array. Like I'm just like going an array onto the a JSON array, and it's a little tricky. Like if I mess that up, if I forget to like strings, it has to be strings. If I forget to make something a string, if it's still an int or something, and I can mess things up. And that's regardless of whether we're doing a big push. It has nothing to do with Flutter. It has nothing to do with this. It's just me messing up the JSON array, because JSON arrays are kind of tricky. I'd actually much rather write HTML like you're talking about. It's like if you could convert HTML to JSON nicely, which I have looked at, kind of like, can I just like HTML? It's much more structured in how you like look at it. You can have like a loop in there. Like if you've used Blade, you use what's the Go one, Temple?
Temple.
Yeah, so I'm sure they have nice
Temple.
like looping and if statements, and you can't do this if you're just you're just showing a JSON array. You can't put for each loops inside that JSON array. So it's kind of hard to construct. So basically what I'm saying is I make mistakes sometimes. I mess up the formatting and I cause some comma error. So, now I know immediately if I made that mistake. Rather than having to, what I used to do is I would wait a few days and then find out from a customer that like this page no longer loads. So this is what this is why I'm keeping API Toolkit definitely, because I like to build more of these. I think there's a future in this kind of server-driven apps. People love apps. You don't have to log in all the time. You can see all your data, even if it's not complex. Just having that convenience, I think, is important. So I intend to do more of those, and I think API Toolkit is kind of the main way that I'll make sure they're working.
Do you have any things you would like to see on the platform, like any feature requests, product direction ideas?
Yeah. Well, I haven't really thought about that because it's sort of covered my use case really well. I haven't really considered what I would add to it. Some of the statistics that are on there. Let's see. Let me take a look here. Just want to sort of look at the dashboard again. There is a lot of first of all, there's a lot of stuff on here that I don't even really look at, just because my main concern is errors. We do have a latency thing, so I haven't thought that much about the speed of it. That could be a concern, and I may at some point want to sort of speed things up, and then I would sort of use that more. I think what I would, if it changes an error section, I may need to think a little bit about what else I would need. It's not something I've really considered that much yet.
Maybe instead I could bounce some of the things we're thinking about and just get your opinion. So we've started to feel like for a lot of people, they're really just building backend applications or microservices to expose some APIs, or even if it's just, general web services. And right now we're logging all the requests that come in and out, and also the errors, the exceptions that happen. But we found that sometimes to debug an issue, you need a little bit more than that. So sometimes you want the logs, the backend logs that happen during a request. So we rolled out this support for logins, so sending your backend logs to APItoolkit. And what we try to do is correlate the logs with the requests themselves. So maybe you see a 500 request and you can expand it and see, okay, these logs happened, these errors happened. What do you think about that?
I mean, that sounds interesting to me. I would worry a little bit. So this is just like, I like that. First of all, because I did see that there was a 500. My assumption was that there was no way to know from APItoolkit what that 500 was, because this is the real app. It's not. We're not. This is the web-facing, customer-facing side. So usually it doesn't show. It's not like in debug mode or something. So I then went to my server and I checked my normal place that I check for logs. The only concern with that is that people have a lot of integrations with how they do their errors. It does. Maybe you have a good handle on this. I use something called Bugsnag sometimes. It's it's somehow, I think it's a service provider. I installed it so long ago that I barely remember, but it sort of reroutes all my errors to something else and then emails them to me. So I would be a little worried that there would be some issues with integrating, because I know people use a lot of different sort of error tracking stuff. Might not go directly to their logs. So that might be just kind of something to look out for. But I like that idea a lot. I mean, if there was an easy way for it to tell me what the 500s were, I wouldn't want to have to prove my other systems. Maybe, but that's just me. I don't know.
Yeah. There's a standard now that is becoming more popular called OpenTelemetry. So what I did was build on top of that, just so we don't have to lock anyone into, or you have to install an SDK to send us errors or logs, and a lot of providers also support OpenTelemetry. I have to check for Bugsnag, but I know platforms like Sentry support OpenTelemetry.
Nice.
So that is the thinking. Assuming there was a way to collect it, in a very smooth way. Do you find it useful that when you see 500, you know what?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, basically, the time it goes, this is always on my mind. When I first see that there's been a 500 error, time from seeing that to seeing what it was is a very important block of time. So if that's immediate through APItoolkit, right, what I usually have to do is I've got to log into the server. I do this is, either I get it, depending if I'm using Bugsnag, I kind of wait for the email because they usually email pretty quickly. But even that, it's kind of like, I wish I could like just know what it was now. If I don't use Bugsnag, then what I do is I just like SSH immediately into the production server, and I do a cat on the Laravel log and see what the last item was. That can take them, maybe I'm not at my computer, maybe I'm not quite ready to SSH in. Some places I tend to work from cafes and other places a lot of times, and a lot of those public free Wi-Fi don't allow SSH connections. And so, and I'm just
I
like,
faced that in Montana.
yeah, that's I hate when I don't. I always check that when I first sit down to do work, because I'm like, if I need to push code, I got to be able to do SSH.
I think that is the key part of the problem, that you should not have to SSH to look at. I mean, obviously, you should have the option to SSH when needed, but for a lot of the most common problems that you have all the information already. I see the requests, I see the body that was wrong, I see the errors that happened, the stack trace, and I also see even if it's a debug log, if it was just some info logs that are all related to that request. This request happened and these are the logs.
If you can pull that off, I mean, that would be awesome. That would be really beneficial. Because I did get a 500 while, like I said, while he was messing around, while we were trying stuff out. And I didn't know what it was at first, had to go check it out, see what the thing was. So no, that would be big for me.
We actually have this rolled out, but it's still in a better state.
Nice.
But yeah, I'm happy that you see it useful, so that kind of motivates me to.
No, that's like, like I said, there's a lot of features on APItoolkit, and a lot of them I won't use, but that one, once if we do get a 500 again for whatever reason, I would immediately want to use that one. So yeah.
Okay.
Count that up.
So I really appreciate all of this feedback you've given me today. I don't want to take all of your time anymore. I'm
very happy to talk about it. I've loved using it.
Thanks a lot.
It's given me a lot of confidence in my API and in this little companion app that I've got, which is just kind of like, that's, as we were discussing, I think before the call, it's very valuable to feel that something is stable and confident, that you don't have to worry about it. So I go for that in a lot of things. So I appreciate I've enjoyed using the tool.
Maybe one last question.
Oh, yeah.
Have you used any similar product in the past, or anything that you felt was similar?
Oh, I haven't. Closest I've got is kind of have my own logging middleware, which literally just takes every single request that comes in and throws it into a whole request into a JSON array and puts it into the database. And so the internal logging software I use, it's middleware, just hand rolled. Like I said, it doesn't do a lot, but it keeps user information if that exists, because sometimes we get requests to weird URLs from random places, so it logs those too. But if there's a user request, I think it also maybe keeps the IP, but I'm not sure about that. But basically I just try to grab something, because in the case, and this is for the main web app, I'm not using APItoolkit for the main web app because it's just a different, it's not the same sort of structure. It's not a JSON array. For my logging, I've always done that. I do that on pretty much every app. It's just have my own little user logs. It's like a sanity check. Also, if I really need to, I can go in and recreate somebody's entire history of sort of how they're using the site, because I'll get people telling me like things broken, and then I can go look in and see, okay, here's the things they actually clicked on, here's the request, here's the response. So I do some of that. That's probably the closest thing to a competing similar thing, but I don't have any tools built around that. It just plopped into a database and I can run queries on it.
I think that was a very primary use case that pushed us to build APItoolkit, because I worked in banking. So I worked at a company called OP in years back. And a very common use case would be user goes to their bank and tells their bank, oh, this transaction was not real. And banks would send us this list of transactions that are being contested, and we have until noon to respond and say, okay, this is valid, this is not valid.
Wow.
So the only way to know if any of this transaction is valid is to go look at the customer's entire history, exactly what they're doing, every single thing. And so that was learning how to just store everything became very important at that point. And then of course evolved into, okay, now you have this data. What kind of insight can you get out of it?
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. So Okay, I think that was my main questions. So thanks again for your time today. I really appreciate the feedback.
Anytime. Yeah, I thank you
Thank you.
for reaching out and talking.